Welcome, everybody. I'm Sunil Amrith, Professor of History and Chair of the South Asian Studies Council here at Yale. Welcome to the second installment of the South Asia Development Dialogues. Together with my colleague Rohini Pandey, we put this series together as a way to bring historical perspectives into the discussion of some of the most pressing development challenges in the world, using South Asia as a starting point, at least, to consider how history can inform policy. And I'm delighted that for this second installment, again, Catherine Cheney, reporter at DevEx, has very kindly agreed to facilitate and host the conversation. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you, Sunil, and thrilled to have you join us as one of our featured experts today, given some of the work you've done in this space. So thanks everyone for joining us for this critical topic. As you know, if you're joining today, across South Asia, migrant workers have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Just for a bit of context for those who are less familiar, in India, the initial COVID-19 lockdown was imposed with only hours' notice, and this led to a mass exodus of migrant workers from major cities, which unsurprisingly, perhaps drove up infections. Meanwhile, South Asian migrant workers who were abroad found themselves subject to deportation or were even stranded and unable to return home. So like every topic featured in this event series, history is instructive. We've seen these linkages between pandemics and migration before, and history could teach us a few lessons, could teach policymakers a few lessons. That's what we'll be discussing today. We're joined by several experts who can help us bridge history and public policy during this time of crisis. And it's worth noting that what we're learning now when it comes to COVID-19 and migration could apply in future pandemics and epidemics, as well as climate change, which will also drive major changes in terms of migration. So our experts today will share insights from research into past pandemics in South Asia, experiences from responses to other disease outbreaks, as well as current research on the impact of COVID-19 on migrant workers. I'll quickly introduce our speakers before asking them an initial question to get us started. And as I mentioned in the first iteration of this series, we really want this to be a conversation. We had great questions last time, so I'd encourage you to keep those questions coming. If you're joining us on Zoom, just go ahead and type questions into the Q&A function and I'll see them and get to as many as I can throughout the conversation. So just to go ahead and quickly introduce our speakers and get their take on what brings them here today. Kavita Sivaramakrishnan is an associate professor of socio-medical sciences at Columbia University. She's a scholar focused on global public health history and South Asian history, with interest in the history of epidemics and the politics of health. Charity Troyer-Moore is Director for South Asia Economic Research at Yale, Economics Research at Yale, at the Yale Macmillan Center specifically. Her research has included large-scale phone surveys of women, migrant workers, and other vulnerable groups affected by the COVID-19 crisis. Rory Stewart, who you saw last time in the first iteration of the series, thrilled to have him back. He's a senior fellow at the Yale Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, where he focuses on contemporary politics in crisis and on international development and intervention in fragile and conflict-affected states. He served as the UK Secretary of State for International Development, where he doubled the UK's investment in international climate and environment. And very relevant to this discussion, also worked on the Ebola response, where I think there are some lessons we should certainly be paying attention to now. And Sunil, who you heard from earlier, is the Renu and Anand Dhawan Professor of History at Yale and current chair of the South Asian Studies Council. His research focuses on the histories of environment, migration, and public health across South and Southeast Asia, so certainly very relevant to our discussion today. I want to start with this question for each of you, and maybe we'll go in the order I just described, just as a way for our audience to quickly hear what brings you here today and essentially why you're excited for this topic of conversation. So as Sunil mentioned, this event is part of a series, Economic Policy Lessons from History. So when it comes to applying insights from history to policy issues in South Asia, why is history so critical to inform our discussions of migration during this COVID-19 time? So we'll start with Kavita.
Hi. History has been important for me to understand pandemics and epidemics, partly because I think it offers a certain, pandemics offer a certain kind of rupture, a moment when people seem to feel there's a moment it's a kind of dramatic and episodic moment, a moment when you feel that there's possibilities for things to go down the tube, to get much worse, but there's also the possibility for certain kinds of reconstruction, for certain kinds of reform and policy shift. So for historians in particular, to study the past is interesting because you can see in some ways if there's continuity or discontinuity Are there ways in which we can examine and take lessons, but also see crisis as specific and distinct moments in time? And I think that's been really valuable, particularly to look at pandemics and migrants for me.
Thank you. Looking forward to hearing a bit more about your research soon. But Charity, can you jump in on what brings you here and why is history so critical to discussions around migration today?
Right. Well, I think, Catherine, you went into a very nice description of some of the challenges related to migration and the pandemic. And I think the policy response in particular related to India's nationwide lockdown really reflected a little bit of a goldfish mentality, meaning, we have had many pandemics in the past. We have had migrants for as long as humans have existed. And yet somehow there was a lack of understanding about how the two could relate. And, a fundamental misunderstanding of even who migrants in India are and who might be affected by this nationwide lockdown. So I think, taking a look back to understand what are lessons that we have learned from the past in, situations that are similar to this could be very useful. The other thing is that this pandemic is not over. I mean, I think some people have said, India has reached its peak, others disagree, right? So there's still more that we can learn looking ahead for how to continue to deal with second waves and those types of things.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're not just looking back today, we're very much still in it. And there's a lot of uncertainty about what's next. So thank you for that. Rory, can you jump in? Oh, you're on mute, Rory.
This is an extraordinary amateur error to be making. Many apologies. Seems to me that there are 4 different quick lessons that I can see in history here. And a lot of them relate to the question of how quickly or effectively you can respond to pandemics. So one of them is the way in which people's experience of political criticism over previous pandemics affects the way they respond to this one. So in particular, in relation to the WHO, we could see in this particular crisis the impact of them being criticized repeatedly for being too slow to respond to Ebola, then too quick to respond to Ebola, then too slow to respond to Ebola, feeding in very strongly, as well as their particular relations with the Chinese government. I think the second thing is not deep history, but recent history suggests that there is a cultural problem, at least in many countries, of learning from other countries. So one of the most problematic things in the early stage of the response was whether people felt they were happy learning from China, whether they felt the lessons of China could be applied to their own countries. So, and that would be in 2 ways. That was both public health experts saying Chinese society is completely different, so the types of lockdown which were possible in Wuhan are not possible in our own countries, through to people simply questioning the basic data coming out of China and questioning whether China had in fact managed to suppress the disease. In Britain, for example, for about 2 months after China had demonstrated that it could suppress the disease, people in Britain were still insisting at a very senior level that it was impossible to suppress, and that if it appeared to be being suppressed in China, it was because China was falsifying the data. They turned out, of course, to be wrong. The third thing, the notion of listening to experts, I think is very important. And in all these pandemics, and I think this is something I'd love to hear from Kavita about, but there is a real question about the role of expertise and our understanding of these diseases and transmissions of these diseases, because of course, the action that the policymaker takes has to take into account 2 things. Firstly, very narrowly, whether the medical analysis is correct, whether the doctors really know what to do. And secondly, many things which have nothing to do with medical expertise, social questions about tolerance for certain practices, impacts on the environment, impact on education, impact on the economy, and the danger of often asking a public health expert to speculate on things that go well beyond their area of expertise. And then I think finally state capacity, and I'll stop on this. I was in Afghanistan 4 weeks ago. In Afghanistan, it appears that perhaps half the country now has managed to contract COVID. And it's very striking because, of course, they moved very quickly to try to shut down the border with Iran. They attempted to implement many of the same processes which you can see throughout the world. President Ghani was very quick to see the problem and try to respond to it. But for a whole series of very complicated reasons, but which largely go to the question of state capacity, they were entirely unable to do so. So that Afghanistan may well be one of the very first countries in the world to actually genuinely experiment with herd immunity on the back of an enormous number of deaths. Thank you.
Wow, thanks for that, Rory. So much to draw on here. And I do want to come back to that question around expertise. Maybe that's something Kavita can get into a little bit later. But first, I'd love to hear from Sunil. I know you helped put this entire series together with this second iteration of the series, talking about migration specifically. So why is history so instructive when it comes to migration today?
I think for three reasons, really. The first is the patterns of migration. Secondly, the legal and political context with which both migration and pandemic response take place. And the third is the language we use to talk about migration, to talk about migrants. I think all three of these have very deep historical roots. And I think learning from that will help us to understand what is possible in the current moment, but also perhaps where we've limited our options.
Thank you so much for that. And again, what's possible in the current moment, as well as future pandemics and epidemics, as well as the crisis of climate change and what that will mean for migration. So just really grateful to have all your perspectives together on this call. So Kavita, I'd love to start with you as we dive a little deeper. Your research has focused on pandemics and epidemics in India in the 20th and 21st centuries, drawing on many of the lessons that we just previewed from our speakers. So can you expand on the impacts of those crises on migrant workers and perhaps set us up for a discussion around some of the lessons we can learn?
Yeah, thanks. What I've looked at is some of my colleagues tend to look at epidemics and pandemics as being kind of standalone events. They have a beginning and an end. But what I've tried to do in my research is to see really epidemics and pandemics as representing, particularly for the most vulnerable groups like migrant workers, as representing what I call endemic risks. The risks that actually are pervasive from one epidemic and pandemic to the other. They rise and ebb and are connected. So what I've tried to do is to look at really three moments. One is the colonial moment, which is the time of the plague pandemic, which comes in, it arrives in Bombay from Hong Kong in 1896. The second moment is a moment of decolonization in 1958, when there is an influenza pandemic. And the third moment I look at is in 1994, when there's a plague outbreak, an epidemic in the western city of Surat with about 2 million. It's an industrial city with about 2 million inhabitants. And what these three moments really convey to you is that at the beginning of each of these three epidemics and pandemics, the first thing you see is the exodus of migrant workers. And in the beginning, of course, they're part, in the colonial setting, they're part of the industrial capitalism that's represented in Bombay. They're part of the cotton mill industry in Bombay. And that's the point at which what the archival sources really tell you is that you don't hear enough from their voices. What you hear really is a range of the Bombay bourgeoisie, their employers, experts, as Rory pointed out, who are talking in two languages, basically, in the language of charity, talking about how they can be rescued so that they can be retained and they can be kept in the mills and be put to work. And the second language is the vocabulary of pathology, seeing them basically as carriers of pathogens. Everyone is aware that it's not only with the pandemic, but even before, that the workers are staying in neighborhoods in central Bombay, in Parel and other places, which are the most densely populated neighborhoods, and they're already susceptible to a range of diseases, occupational diseases. They are underpaid. So the pandemic only in 1896, 1897, when they begin to leave Bombay, is just exacerbating what's already in place, and which is like a perfect storm that's set up at that point of time. It also brings me to the point that Sunil brought out, who are migrants? By the 1920s in Bombay, 85% of the population in Bombay is not born in Bombay. So who are these migrants? And sometimes, what is the point at which you're a stranger in a city and you move from being a stranger to an outsider? But when do you really become an insider? So some of these workers in these mills have often spent 3 generations in the city, but are still not basically part of what I think is called the social infrastructure. They can get a daily wage. They can be employed, they're not part of the unemployed ranks, but they're still not part of a social network of the infrastructure of the city itself. And that's really a huge issue that comes up time after time. The second window I look at is in 1957-58, which is the decolonization. The time when you would have thought that there would actually be a break in policies from the colonial setting to a decolonized nation in 57-58, which is handling the influenza pandemic. What happens is the health minister in India stands up in the parliament and actually says that at the moment, the first and the second 5-year plan in India is prioritizing industrial output. And all social issues will have to just wait. So labor and the working class are really being made to wait in the cause of modernization and industrial modernization at that point of time. And and that's when you begin. There's a huge policy moment that's really lost, right? In terms of knowing that, in terms of making the connection to not simply look at the pathogen, not simply measure productivity, but to see the social settings within which these workers are inhabiting, and to make the connection between health and public health at that point of time, and the rates of their productivity and attrition. The third moment in Surat in 1994, which is at the cusp when India and its kind of globalized middle class is aspiring to become, it's a new liberal moment. It's a moment when everyone wants to be part of the globalization process. So there's acute shame in India and the middle classes when this plague epidemic happens. In fact, it's reported in all the newspapers, the sense that this is a colonial moment that's revisiting us in a neoliberal moment. And that's again a time when there's a huge policy, there's an opportunity for policy. There's an opportunity for experts to speak up, because Surat is a city which is municipally compromised. There are a range of diamond polishing workers, cotton industry workers, all of whom leave the city of Surat. And the only kind of reform you see then is the reform of the municipality, which is very big actually. Surat really transforms itself over a year from being one of the filthiest cities in India to something that holds a certain kind of promise. So you do see a certain policy breakthrough that happens in Surat. But what you don't see is the voices of experts coming in to be able to talk beyond the moment of the pandemic, to talk about a different kind of social and public health restructuring. And that's really the missing link between the local, the state government, and the national government. And there are various moments at which India really responds, and that's again responding to what Rory said, to the kind of shaming that's happening through global health. There's a pressure really of feeling that we have to reflect and say that everything is okay, we've met the international health regulations, but at the same time, there is not this transition from that to a self-reflectivity to think about how we could actually make changes that address this, in a more convincing way. So that's really the couple of points that have come out. And finally, what I want to say is that we tend to look at migrant workers from an economic lens, as people who are seeking as economic migrants as the source of remittances. But we can't ignore the sort of social wounds and trauma that when you look at 3 events like this, when generation after generation, migrant workers are pushed out at the time of a crisis, you can't but turn away from that trauma and try to understand what happens generationally to workers who are seen as coming from backward parts of India. And I think this is it's not only a crisis that's economic, but it's far more substantial because they get described in the voices of others. And I don't think we can get away from that. There's always only the middle classes and experts who speak for them. So I'd really like to kind of pitch in and point that out as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Very powerfully put. And it leads us nicely into Charity's work, because you mentioned this dynamic that migrants get described in the voices of others. And today we have new capabilities to fight that dynamic, to really understand and hear the voices of migrants and see them as, have a more nuanced view of who these people are as individuals, not just viewing them through an economic lens or these other lenses, as you mentioned. So Charity, you've been collecting data on migrants across India as they return to their rural homes. And of course, we're in the midst of this crisis, so the changes continue. What have your findings been?
Yeah, thanks. And Kavita, I think that's a great point that, we will still be describing the experiences of migrants, but hopefully we're getting a little bit closer to understanding better the picture for them and how they see things and what they're going through. So after the lockdown was announced, Catherine, as you mentioned, we began collecting data. This was myself, Rohini, who's here on the panel as well, and then others at Yale and actually at other universities as well, and have collected data at about 6 different points since the lockdown began from various groups of migrants returning from all across India. And I think, we've learned as we've gone along kind of how the situation is unfolding for them. So I guess what I'd like to do is kind of give you a glimpse of maybe how we've seen things changing over time for them as well. I mean, the first is that when migrants return to their rural homes, and this kind of reflected, it worked differently depending on where they were returning to. But in some places, they really did face harassment and discrimination, had trouble getting back into their rural villages because people were very concerned that they would be, spreading COVID as they returned home. And we saw that that was something that was a little bit stronger among minority populations, that sort of thing. And so that's kind of a recurring theme in the data that we've collected, is that individuals that, already are migrants and were vulnerable in many ways because of the lockdown, existing vulnerabilities such as being part of a minority population, a scheduled caste population, women, that sort of thing, tend to be worse on a variety of outcomes that we're looking at, and tend to be suffering a little bit more. But fortunately, once migrants returned back, it was time to move to the fields to do agricultural labor. And actually, the Kharif season was ongoing. And so migrants that were flooding back to rural areas were in lots of ways absorbed into agricultural labor in many of these places. So this was a fortunate thing. The rains this year were good. The harvest this year has been good. So this was a bit of a bright spot amidst, a really challenging time. So many of these migrants, ended up leaving jobs in factories or different things that they were doing, maybe as construction workers, going then and working in the fields. But then, after this labor has dried up, there's no more work available for them. We're looking at individuals in different states across the country, depending on where you live, 1 in 2 might be working. In some places, it's a little bit higher. So obviously then well-being declines. And what we saw throughout the summer were these important vulnerabilities emerging. So 30% of migrants from one state we interviewed were not receiving cash or food or any sort of support from the government, and were unlikely to be working as well. Over 60% were reporting spending down their savings, reducing consumption of essentials. Over half were borrowing money in one state that was not doing very well, a third in another state, taking loans from family and friends. And 5 to 6 in 10 universally by August were reporting needing some form of credit for the upcoming months just to manage their own expenses. The government tried to respond to this by supposedly providing work through its public works NREGA program, but when we and NREGA work did increase vastly, but it wasn't migrants, as far as we can tell, that were really getting this work, unfortunately. And they really had, just like they had trouble accessing rations in urban areas or food in urban areas, they had trouble accessing this program in rural areas as well. They were neither tied to the city or to the rural areas. And so kind of unsurprisingly, now we're seeing migrants moving back to urban areas where they can find some form of employment now that lockdown restrictions are less strict.
Thanks so much for that, Charity. And I just wanted to remind our audience to send questions. We already have a question that's come in on India's handling of COVID-19 and migration, which we'll get to in our discussion soon, but do keep those questions coming. We're covering a lot of ground, so I don't want you to forget what questions you might have. I want to go to Rory now. So Rory, as I mentioned earlier, and for those who didn't know, you were the UK's International Development Secretary during the Ebola outbreak, and I'd love to hear any lessons from that response when it comes to the connection with migration, and how you would connect that to what we're seeing today and how we might better prepare in the future.
Well, I'm afraid the awful truth of it is that dealing with these kinds of epidemics feels, at least, or felt to me as a politician, Secretary of State, and I imagine often feels to policymakers as choices between what feel like almost impossible alternatives. So in relation to what we were dealing with in Eastern DRC, you were firstly having to weigh up the fact that it was happening in a situation which felt primarily as though the cause was political conflict rather than the disease itself. So that area, Beni Batembo, and a lot of the migration happening there was as much the result of armed conflict as it was of the disease itself. And that then contributed to other problems which were very profound. Conspiracy theories, for example, amongst people that led many people to believe that Ebola wasn't real, or Ebola was in fact a disease which had been introduced by political opponents. I think the second thing, though, just to return briefly to Kavita and the 1896 outbreak in Mumbai, it seems to me that there too, there very little seems to have changed. I mean, looking back at it, what you seem to have is an extraordinary fight then, right back in the late 19th century, between the British colonial state trying to take very, very aggressive repressive measures, very aggressive public health measures against people, which provokes an extraordinary backlash and actually leads famously to the killing of W.C. Rand, who's the British public health officer who's trying to impose these repressive measures. A huge amount of enthusiasm for a vaccine. I mean, just to try to bring it up to date today. The great hero of the moment was the man who produced what was believed to be this revolutionary vaccine, which now in retrospect doesn't seem to have been much of a vaccine. It's not a vaccine that we use today. Its efficacy was rather limited. It had horrendous side effects, but this guy got a knighthood, there were huge statues built around him, etc. And the incredible anxieties in Indian society and in colonial society around how much you can actually do to try to intervene in people's lives and use repressive measures to try to stop the spread of the disease. And we can see the analogy today. We are now very, very much more comfortable unifying around the possibility of a vaccine than we are around the non-medical public health measures, which you might take, which continue to be incredibly controversial today, as indeed they were in late 19th century India. The people that were involved in the public health measures are largely villainized, and the doctors who produced the vaccine remain the heroes today, even though it's a bit questionable whether the vaccine made much difference.
Thank you, Rory. I'd love to bring Sunil into this, given the relevance of your research on migration in the region. So just to start, any reactions to what our panelists have said so far, or something you'd like to add before we move into further discussion?
Really struck by what Charity said about migrant workers struggling to access resources both in the rural areas and in the urban areas, and the sense of being, in a sense, caught in between and belonging in neither place. I mean, I think that really does resonate from a lot of the historical work that I've done. The part of my work that most sort of speaks to the current moment was actually not a pandemic. It was the impact of the Great Depression on Asian migration, because that is the moment where you see something quite similar to what we've seen, especially in terms of international migration now, where really quite suddenly patterns of migration go into reverse. So for 70 years, Indians and Chinese have been moving to Southeast Asia in huge numbers, tens of millions of people. And suddenly when the Great Depression hits, for the very first time, you see a reversal of that move. And you see deportations, but you also see people trying to get home and finding they have no roots in the rural communities of India, finding they have no access to welfare, finding that they, in a sense, are sort of outsiders in this double sense. And I think one of the questions for me, especially looking forward, is how these shocks that interrupt the regular patterns of migration upon which so many families depend, whether they lead to changing aspirations, whether they lead, so they, in my case, they did do this, which is to say, when these shocks came, it actually led Indian and Chinese migrants who had imagined themselves really moving back and forth and circulating between home and the cities of Southeast Asia where they went. It made them aspire to stay, to make a place for themselves. You actually start to see a real shift from a sort of circular pattern of migration to much more permanent settlement. And I don't know what the impact of this lockdown, global lockdown, will be in terms of how people think about sort of the normalness of migration, particularly of a circular kind.
Thank you, Sunil. Really well put in terms of kind of broadening the scope, hearing that your research actually looks at the Great Depression. And it reminds me of something that Kavita said earlier when she said pandemics offer a rupture, a dramatic and episodic moment, possibilities for things to go down the tube. That's the case for pandemics and epidemics, for the Great Depression, certainly, or economic recessions, as well as climate change. All these moments, climate change, a long protracted crisis, that can affect migration. And that leads me to a question, because in preparing for this call, I had a conversation with Kavita, and she mentioned that there is a tragedy in that this comes up again and again, and again, the big policy question is, why don't we have certain kinds of protections in place to deal with this every time there is a crisis? So I just like to throw that out to our panelists, anyone who wants to jump in. Essentially, as we continue to see the same dynamics and history is repeating itself, and likely will in the future, why don't we have better policies in place? And perhaps that will get us to a question from our audience about the Indian policy response specifically.
Catherine, can I jump on to that question and just add a little bit? I think, Sunil, as you're talking about, these migrants that had viewed themselves as kind of circular migrants and suddenly decided, no, I need to settle in one place or the other. Yeah, I'd be very curious to learn from, Kavita and Sunil, who have this understanding of history. Was that circular migration by choice, a preference, or something that was, necessary because of the political and legal ramifications of settling in one place or the other? Because, I think what we're seeing right now is people who are circular migrants really slip through the cracks in lots of ways. And I don't know that that's their preference, but I'd be curious to hear more.
Should I jump in? Yeah. So I wanted to respond to both Sunil and Charity there. I think my experience has been with migrants, for instance, to Punjab, which has been a state that has had the Green Revolution, attracted migrants from other parts of North India. And I think there's both been a kind of push and pull. There's been both the pull of wanting to go there to be able to get a wage, especially in some of the labor intensive work around rice plantation. So if you stood on Jalandhar station in September or October, you would see Punjabi farmers there literally hauling off the trains labor that's come from Bihar and UP to be taking them to their fields. And so in a way, that seems to be as if they're attracted by the wages. But I think the story, and Sunil will add to this, is much more complicated. There's also always a push even from families, right? Even in the 19th century, we all know that the second son was often sent from the villages of Ratnagiri to Bombay to work in the mills. You would keep the elder son with you, but you would send the other one off. So there's a push from the family in terms of aspirations of also sending people as migrants, for perhaps not for the rest of the family to join, because the rites of passage always bring back these workers home. So I think there's actually, it's impossible to understand these workers only looking at them at the urban setting or looking at them only in the rural setting. I think there's such a deep connection, it just shows you, between the city and the countryside. And unless you kind of look at the social insecurities in both that families and communities are giving you a basis, but you do need a wider network, and that the city itself is inadequate. Unless you look at both, I think it's impossible to understand the true precarity of the migrant worker, who can neither return empty-handed back to the village, neither can they go to the city and be completely accepted. That the second point I wanted to make was also very quickly to address Rory's point about the kind of similarities between the colonial pandemic of 1896-97 and the seemingly, the seeming kind of continuities with the present. And I think what's interesting and what's really different, I think, at least in one point, is the role of experts, in the sense that the public trust of experts, of Western biomedicine, of surgeon generals, of British medical officers was very low. So in a way, people actually feared not only the policies, but they also feared those who were communicating the information. So at a point, most of the Bombay residents were saying, we've done everything. We've used carbolic acid, we've washed ourselves, we've destroyed our homes, we've used the Hafekin vaccine, but we're still told all this, but there's no trust in the expert. I think now you have more pontificating experts currently in India, but at least they seem to have a voice that seems to be more local in some senses. So I think there's, at least for some time initially, there's been more of a trust in what they say. But I'd agree with Rory that there are several stages of a pandemic. You start with a certain kind of certainty or belief or public trust in an expert, and that public trust tends to erode itself as the uncertainty of the science, as all the other things change with the pandemic itself. So the place of that expert is not constant. But I think the colonial and post-colonial setting at least offer that difference. And I think Ebola is also a contrast between local spokesmen and experts and aid-giving external experts who join in and who are airdropped into certain spaces and who elicit much less trust, I think.
Can I just come in on that? I mean, I think this is fascinating. I mean, this is going well beyond where we are, but that's a very interesting observation by Kavita, because we tend to assume that trust is much lower now than it would have been 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we tend to assume that social media, for example, is an engine for generating distrust of hierarchies, elites, creating, Martin Gurry's terms, a revolt of the public, where we are suspicious of any form of expertise. It's rather sort of salutary to be reminded by Kavita that in some ways we are more trusting of expertise than we were in 1896. I think that's really interesting. Just also very quickly, just on the policy question around migration, it's worth bearing in mind a much, much smaller level that versions of this problem exist even domestically within developed countries. One of the things I experienced a great deal as a member of parliament is because an enormous amount of provision to citizens comes from their local government. People who move between local government boundaries are often in a terrible situation. I found it very difficult to try to find housing for constituents, very difficult to find specialized schooling for constituents, very difficult to find social care packages for constituents who'd moved even between county council boundaries in Britain. Okay, finish for me.
Thank you, Rory. I want to bring in some questions from the audience here. So if you don't mind me sharing your name, I know people can ask questions anonymously if they prefer, but Sanjeev Kumar asks about the handling of migration in India. And here's his question. Even after mismanaging the migrant issue at the onset of the ongoing pandemic, the Modi government was recently given a big approval in the state which was most severely affected. Could you please reflect on this event? Why did people fail to signal to the government that it has so badly affected their lives in India? Just verbatim sharing what a member of the audience asked, as we would if he were here to ask it, camera on and live. So any reactions to, I suppose it's an opportunity to look at the India policy response today.
Yeah. Does anyone want to jump in? I could do it if
you can go ahead, and then I'll definitely like to add, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the verdict, if you're referring particularly to the Bihar elections most recently, I think the verdict is people, it brings up the larger question of how much does public health really shape politics and elections. So I think it's a little more complicated than that, because I think people see the state as having imposed a lockdown initially, which was severe, which was very difficult, especially for migrant workers. But also, you look, the government in a way becomes more important to trust and as an anchor at the time of a crisis. So in a way, it can work both ways. You can work with huge distrust, but I think public health stops being, it's not been, at least in this last state election, not the sole determining factor. I think there's been a range of things in the way the government has been able to publicize a certain kind of decisiveness, a sense of experts and the Prime Minister being in control. So it's a lot of, it's the rhetoric that's created around elections and the projections and how people understand them and what are the alternatives they see in place if they had to. So I think the question of politics and public health are much more complicated than a single moment in a pandemic really makes it out to be. And how much it shifts people's votes is really a moot point as far as I'm concerned. Thanks. That was a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Just to add to that, I think I have a bit of insight into what, at least how the state might have been thinking about the response to all this. And I think, there was a conscious decision at some point that this was not going to be an electoral issue. I was kind of puzzled myself as to why is there not more in the media about this situation beyond kind of, the very tragic stories that we all heard and saw and that were on the international news. But beyond that, there was not that much in the media talking about the migrant situation, as time went on. And in fact, I had a colleague, please review lots of Bihari newspaper and media articles for me and let me know, are they talking about the migrant issue? I mean, this seems so strange that there's no conversation here. And, the migrants were just not a focus. And so it was really an issue that was downplayed. So, there were not as severe consequences as I think many of us thought that there could have been or possibly should have been.
Can I just ask, this is really a question for Charity and Kavita and Sunil, I guess. Was there a sense that it mattered that apparently Orissa and Tamil Nadu had dealt with, or Kerala had dealt with some of these situations better than other states? Was that relevant in the political?
Sunil, do you want to step in or should I? Well, I think the Indian public doesn't see, if I might say so, in terms of development and health politics, parts of the North and public health politics there are viewed very differently from the ways in which we view the expectations of public health, the expectations of health systems performance are so different, Rory, between the North and the South. And the migrant crisis in Kerala, especially the return migrants from the Middle East, as you point out, what was dealt with much more efficiently and very, very differently. And people will say, oh, well, it's a difference of scale, it's a difference of a history of health systems that have worked better, a range of things. But the comparisons don't come up because I think there's the invisibility of one to the other because they're not seen as being comparable. It's almost like going, as a policymaker, what kinds of case studies do you offer? Case studies that seem viable and reasonable. And, when I've gone to health systems experts in South India telling them this is what we did in the North, they'll say, well, we've done this 10 years ago in many ways, and we've done it pretty efficiently, especially the public distribution system, nutrition programs, and even chronic disease screening. So it's almost as if it's two things that people didn't even expect to compare in a way, because the scale and the politics of it and the precarity in North India of migrant workers has been so different. And I think also
can I just very quickly, sorry, this is so fascinating for me though, but just a little bit on Orissa, which again seems to have performed well both in terms of public health and also in terms of disaster management, despite having very low development indicators.
Yeah, so I think Orissa certainly has had a record of cyclones, and they've claimed that they've certainly had a much better response, partly because I think they've had a longer history of dealing with health crises, which, so I think it's worked well in Orissa, but certainly UP and Bihar, it hasn't been part of their elections because I think migrant workers, we see them as a single category because that's the focus of our work. But as a political category, how is that translated vis-a-vis the politics of caste, vis-a-vis the politics of urban rural constituencies? And it doesn't translate in the same ways, which actually brings us to what all of us are talking about which is the barrier in translating this into policy, fundamentally. How do you make that leap is the key question. And I would really say this is the key point, which is knitting what all of us are saying together.
Could I just ask, it sounds like there are limitations in terms of these lessons being shared across states, but what has effective policy looked like? If you can just expand on that a little bit. I mean, we've outlined a lot of the challenges, and there was just a question about some of the policy failures in India. But to the extent that we're seeing signs of what it looks like to effectively manage the interests of public health and the interests of migrant workers, what are some lessons?
I can at least jump in with what we've seen kind of comparing across two different contexts, different states that had kind of different levels of governance and state capacity. When we look at, survey responses from migrants from one state versus another, we see entirely different situations, right? So in one location, they're less likely to have access to food, less likely to have access to cash transfers from the government, less likely to find employment, less likely to get work under this NREGA public works program, and more likely to be food insecure. And then in this other location, 9 in 10 have ration cards and are able to access them at least once they get back to their home state. A higher proportion report receiving cash, more want to work for the government's public works program and are able to. I mean, we think that, in the former case, there are a lot of discouraged workers, right? So I think building in that state capacity where everyone is included into the safety net, and there's a focus on portability of benefits, which is a huge, massive exercise that requires coordination across state and central lines, these types of things. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but I think the first step is that building blocks of good governance, that where a safety net scheme is going to capture as many people within the system as possible and not overlook those. I mean, that's much easier said than done, of course, but.
Thank you for that. Kavita, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think working in public health, I feel that when we think of translating things into public health policy, I think advocacy is really key. And in some ways, I think some states, some urban areas have had a longer history of social movements and public health movements that make it much, much easier at a time of crisis. So the crisis really, you have to be ready for it. I don't think at that point of time, at the beginning and end of it, you can actually put pressure to translate it into policy. So I think with things that already are pre-existing, prior record of mobilizing for social and welfare policy is what really is successful. So the so-called end of a pandemic is the time when work begins, really, rather than it being the time when things come to a close. So I think that's really important to remember, because nothing really will happen in a beneficial way during a crisis unless we are ready for it before. Because we already know who are the worst affected, and we know it both in the US, but we know it in every other part of the world. So it doesn't require a pandemic to really shine a light on that. But are we ready for that crisis compounding what already exists is the big question, I think.
Absolutely. I have more questions coming in here from the audience. And just as a reminder to everyone, we have about 10 minutes left, so get your questions in. I'd like to pose this question from Akshaya Tanka. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Asking two questions somewhat interrelated. The first is around data when it comes to labor in rural areas. So Charity touched on this a little bit, but the question is, there appears to be a lot of data on how the current pandemic is affecting the status of migrant workers in urban spaces. Can you expand on the data of what's happening to labor in rural areas? So we heard about that a little bit in terms of agriculture this year, but anything you might want to expand on. And then the second question is, secondly, is the currently enduring crisis ground to rethink how we study the urban and or the rural as part of a continuum rather than as discrete and separable? So again, I think we touched on this dynamic earlier, but maybe expand a little further. Maybe we'll start with Charity, and then if others want to jump in.
Sure, I'm happy to speak to this idea of rural labor market opportunities or rural work that's ongoing, and the urban work as well. So as I mentioned, many individuals are now saying that they're going back to urban areas. I think the key thing to highlight though is when I say many, I don't mean all, right? So in the two different states we've been working in one state, about 1 in 2 or maybe 5 to 6 in 10 are saying they expect to migrate again within a year. That number's higher in this other state where people are really struggling more. So maybe closer to 3 and 4 or something like that. So I guess this begs the question of what happens in these rural areas. And, I guess this gets back to the point too, that the pandemic is not over. And we've had these large shock to rural areas. I mean, we can imagine there are lots of economic consequences, whether it's a drop in wages or maybe an increase in agricultural activity, an increase in land under cultivation. But we also, and so some of those things could be good and could have good impacts in terms of economic multipliers. And some of those could be challenging, right? There could be people that are forced out of jobs. It could be that, gender discrimination is more prevalent because there are lots of willing men back ready to work. And, the idea is that if a man is ready to work, we should give him the job over the woman. So there are, potential problems with this. There are also potential opportunities because many migrants have come back with, potentially skill sets or, would be interested in, small enterprises, that type of thing, and they could be catalyzed for non-agricultural labor and SMEs and that type of thing. I think we don't really know what's going to happen at this point in time, and we should continue to collect data on that front to really understand it a little bit better. I'm also curious, because this goes back to this idea that others were talking about of the ruptures. This was Kavita, I think, talking about this, and Sunil, you were speaking to this a bit as well. And there's this question to me of, okay, this is a rupture, this is a juncture. How can we take this excess labor now that's gone back to rural areas and help catalyze growth? I mean, I think that's part of the reason people left rural areas in the first place. Are there opportunities here? Are there opportunities that we could learn from previous pandemics in sub-Saharan Africa as well that Rory was speaking to? So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think it also means that, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Did you want to go?
Yeah, please go for it.
I think I want to just quickly add to what Charity was saying, that it's also the cities that are overburdened and underprepared really to be receiving them back. So I think we haven't solved some of these issues at all. I mean, if you still have this vision of a neoliberal, globalized, Mumbai 2060 that McKinsey dishes out as a report, that's not the city that at all even looks at the underbelly of a formal city, which is the, all the underclass or the subalterns of these migrants who are going back to the city. The formal planned city, the way it's envisioned these days, the neoliberal city doesn't have spaces. It's underprepared to host migrants or to even have them back. So it offers clearly an economic wage, but as I said, what is the social infrastructure? that could actually bring them back and make them feel like they could stay in the city while keeping their roots back in rural areas. And I think that's a question that has to be tackled at several levels of policy. It's not just a labor question. It's not just an economic policy question. It's a question of who belongs to a city, and should we still call migrants just migrants? Because I think it's a convenient way of moving away from seeing them as citizens to seeing them as fully members both of the villages that they come from, but also of cities. Seeing them as a floating population is just a convenient excuse not to actually make any concrete policy interventions that would be realistic. And I think it's convenient also for the middle classes to see them as that, in that sense, to see them through this lens of charity, as I was saying earlier.
Powerful point. I know Rory wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Just very quickly, I just to be a bit pessimistic for a moment, I think we need to be very conscious of how difficult historically we found it to really create viable, sustainable rural regeneration programs. I mean, it continues to be obviously ethically and logically very appealing. And we can see the problems within the cities, and we can see the problem that urbanization has caused. But unfortunately, there is a countervailing factor, which is the industrialization of agriculture has meant almost everywhere a huge problem for trying to employ large numbers of people on the land in rural areas. And I can think of very, very few examples worldwide where we've really managed to counter the move towards urbanization. And I think, you know, I fear my pessimistic instinct is you can do some things around the margins, but in the end, the basic move of our societies continues to be from the rural to the urban.
Rory, we've had a question come in that I'd love to get your take on, at least to start, and then we'll see if other panelists want to jump in. This is actually a question from Rohini Pandey, who you heard about earlier, is helping to bring this series together along with Sunil. So she asks, it turns out remittances from temporary migration are a fragile way to end poverty. What's the alternative, or how do we make them less fragile? I'm glad we have a question in on remittances. So Rory, can we start on you?
Yeah, well, very quickly on this, and then I'll hand over to three far more qualified people. I mean, it's just to frame for people who are non-specialists on the call that remittances has become very, very fashionable in the world of international development. And people have pointed out that in Africa, for example, many multiples of the amount of money that's spent by formal development agencies comes in remittances. And of course, in the general push to find the next big thing, remittances has been that next big thing for the last few years. And of course, this crisis and what's happened to migration has caused a huge problem for this. It's likely, therefore, to push us back to some of the more difficult traditional development problems and away from the idea that somehow remittances on their own are going to be able to solve these problems. But I'm going to stop at that, and I'm going to hand over to the others.
Well put. Do others want to jump in?
To answer the question of remittances, it reminds me of another similar issue, which actually Sunil and Amrita and I have both been interested in, which is the situation of healthcare workers. Because the earlier question is really, which the WHO brings up, is this issue of healthcare workers and their migration promising a certain kind of remittance to their country of origin. I mean, think of these 13 to 14 nursing schools that appear in the Philippines every year, and the export of Filipino nurses. So, clearly it's a very fragile economy in terms of remittances itself. But there are certain countries who've tried to invest back, and if you can't hold back people from leaving, then how do you make sure that in some ways when they're ready to come back, you can actually make the environment such that you can actually offer them certain kinds of investments. So I think it goes both, I'm not sure we can actually prevent people from moving and migration and the issue of trying to find a life elsewhere. But I think it's important, as Rohini's question points out, how do we secure it in such a way that an entire state like Kerala doesn't rely on remittances? How can we make sure that they come back and there's already a use of that remittance in some ways for them to be investing back? And that's what some countries like the Philippines have tried to do, but only with part success, to be able to invite nurses who've left the Philippines to come back in 10 years. But again, it's still so unequal because global flows just can't be controlled. That's one of the things we've all realized. We don't even have proper numbers for who actually leaves and returns and how that whole pathway is.
I'll pause and see if there are other reactions to this question on remittances. And otherwise, with a couple minutes left, go ahead, Sunil.
Just wanted to say, I mean, in a sense, going back a century, remittances have always been very fragile. And if you look at the long history of the 20th century, there are these moments of catastrophic rupture when it comes to migration patterns. And the question is, I mean, that's what happened in the 1940s. I mean, in some ways, in the 1940s, around the time of decolonization after the Second World War, you had many states in Asia saying, we can't rely on remittances. That was the whole developmental project, the idea that you would build welfare states based on the rights of citizens, the rights of citizenship. And of course, that project itself sort of ran into trouble in the 1960s and 1970s, which is when you see once again a kind of upsurge in international migration. So I do think this question of how to stabilize them is a vital one that we don't yet have an answer to.
Thank you, Sunil. And we have just 2 minutes left here. So I'd love to just quickly go back very quickly to each of our panelists, just to make sure we're really delivering on our promise, which I think we have, of focusing on what are insights from history when it comes to this current moment of migration and crisis. Any point you've made that you want to reiterate, or a thought you didn't get to you'd like to share, or a final call to action for this group? And I'll start with Kavita.
I think the only lesson I see from history, I mean, this is not to join Rory in his pessimism in a way, and to look forward, is to see that I think if crises constantly produce certain kinds of ruptures, then they've also produced certain opportunities. And I see that crisis in Surat, when the municipality reforms occurred, efforts by entrepreneurs in Bombay during the 1896-97, during the plague in 1896-97, to set up private plague hospitals. I feel that if we can think small and if we can think local, we can actually think about changes that can happen that have occurred and which can be looked at as very important case studies. I think if we think of it in terms of global health, it's much, much more difficult during a pandemic to see shifts happen on that kind of a scale. So I see very much that the local scale in history has always fed itself into global and other scales. But we really need to see how it's happened in a couple of cities across time to be able to point them out as examples. Otherwise, it's very hard to replicate. This is what people would like to do, but it's very hard.
Thank you. Charity?
I would just like to add that, I mean, I think, Kavita, what you said about the hard work beginning when the pandemic ends and not at the beginning of the pandemic is very true. I mean, India and other places are quite good at going into mission mode and, attacking a problem head on when a real crisis presents itself. But, the real work happens in the day-to-day. And I think one of the first places that we really need to start is to do a better job understanding who migrants are, the different types of migrants that exist, permanent, temporary, circular, international, interstate, intradistrict, all this. The data doesn't speak to that yet. And I think, just getting started with the right type of data collection is going to help push policy in the right direction as well.
Thank you. Rory, I'll go to you.
I think this is also raises some very interesting questions for the developed world. So the basic model in the United States or in Europe is that people will migrate from areas of low economic opportunity predominantly into cities and predominantly recently into service jobs. The problem, and that of course is also true of the fact that many of these service jobs are supported by migrants right the way through the developed world. Those service jobs have been killed now in many ways by the impact of COVID, had a profound impact on the way that cities operate. This is going to be intensified, unfortunately, by developments in AI and robotics. And therefore, there is a very real problem around the economic opportunities available for migrants, whether we're talking about people moving from Detroit to New York, or whether we're talking about people moving from Kerala to Dubai, or moving within India. These kinds of issues are going to be more and more pressing over the next 20, 30 years. And I think COVID has just accelerated our awareness of these problems.
Agreed. Sunil, we'll close with you. Any final thoughts or calls to action you might have?
I mean, in a fundamental sense, I think the pandemic has opened up this question of what and where home is. And I don't think that that's an idea that's necessarily had much purchase in the development world. We talk about stay-at-home orders, we talk about lockdowns, but of course, migration has completely disrupted the relationship between where people are born, where they work, where they die. And I think that this is an opportunity we have perhaps to build institutions and policies that recognize that. And the last thing I want to say is just an invitation to everyone here that the series will recommence at the beginning of next semester, early in February, and we're hoping to have about an event every couple of weeks, and we do hope you will join us for that.
Thank you, Sunil. With that, we will close. I just want to say again what a pleasure it is to moderate these conversations and how much value I see in bringing historians and practitioners together to discuss what we can learn from history during this moment of crisis. So thank you to Sunil and to Rohini and team for pulling this series together and for bringing these great experts together. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time.